Hi, John. Thanks for joining here today. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to interview you about your career and things you've seen in cyber. So, thanks for carving out the time.
My pleasure, Dane.
All right. So, you have had a very interesting story. You've seen a lot of the changes that have happened in cybersecurity. But your story actually goes back to the late 80s where you were a product marketer. And I thought that that would be a really interesting place to start is just what was product marketing like at that time? And I thought maybe you can share a little bit of that because at Cyber PMM, there's a lot of, product marketers. So I thought that would be a cool place to start.
Well, you're immediately making me feel like an old man, but I will. I can start with then I worked for EMC Corporation, which is now part of Dell. I was recruited out of business school. And so EMC at the time was making memory boards and disk drives or disk subsystems for IBM and digital equipment, if those names mean anything to anyone anymore. Um, but I'd say that product marketing was, especially for at EMC, was a lot of sales support. It was making sure to understand the competitive landscape. In my case, we were competing directly with IBM. So we had to know IBM's pricing, IBM's go-to-market, IBM's competitive FUD. And in fact, FUD, I think, originates from IBM. Um, we mostly did a lot of marketing through advertising at that point, and advertising in trade magazines. And then there were some regional shows. IBM put on its show, other manufacturers, but it was hardware based mostly. And what changed over time was it became much more software based. So the hardware is hardware, it's infrastructure, but if you're a manufacturer, there were specialized products or packages. If you were in healthcare, there were specialized packages, and IBM supported them all. So we would have to go to those shows. So I don't know if I'm telling you anything that you didn't know, but it was much more focused, much more kind of, I guess, colloquial at the time.
Very cool. Yeah, I just thought it would be interesting to have the perspective of how that originated because, as a product marketer today and seeing what our core responsibilities are, there's a lot of what you just said that still happens today. So it's interesting to see how that's kind of maintained some consistency. Um,
Yeah, things
so
change much faster now, Dan. I'm sorry to interrupt, but things,
yeah,
um, I mean, we had a product, our next product, and it was a hardware product at the time, and our next product would be a year out or 2 years out. And so it was really focused on just go to market, like I said, sales support. Things change so quickly, and cybersecurity adds the other dimension of we have to be aware of what the adversary is doing. So a lot's changed.
that's a great point, right? So depending on the industry, it might be, especially in cybersecurity, you have to keep up with not only the function part, but also like the industry dynamics, which are pretty hectic for our space, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it looks like, just looking at your profile and your history, so you stayed in marketing for a little bit and then made your way into the market research side of things by joining Forrester in the mid 90s or so. So it'd be interesting to hear how that transition worked and like what your experience was like at Forrester in those early days.
Correct. I joined Forrester in 1995. Uh, if anyone knows Forrester, the founder and the CEO is a guy named George Colony, and I worked directly for George. So it was a much smaller organization at the time. The transition was something I wanted to do because I thought it suited my skill set, and I really liked Forrester, what Forrester was doing at the time. At the time, Forrester was really the champion of the transition to the internet, and as ancient history as that sounds, that was a big deal in 1995. The Mosaic browser had come out a couple of years before, and so this was big. I'd say Forrester really helped me develop my skill set, my communication skills, mostly, and really my writing skills a lot. It was a great place to work. And the transition from marketing to an analyst role, I think I would recommend it to anyone, Dane, because it gives you exposure to the industry. It gives you exposure to a lot more senior people, especially I was more junior at the time. And it's a good stepping stone if that's what you choose to do. Now, in my career, I mostly have been an analyst, but if you wanted to go back into the industry, you could, and you had those opportunities.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to ask you later, maybe a little bit later, about those similarities between product marketing and industry analyst roles, because there seems to be a lot of overlap in the sense of we're both doing market research, we're both trying to understand the industry trends and what personas are like, and so maybe we can touch on that a little bit later.
Sure.
Um, but so from that Forrester experience, it looks like by the way, it would be interesting at that time, the cybersecurity market, was that something that you had exposure to at your time at Forrester, that you maybe saw like what the industry was like in those early days? Because it'd be interesting to compare where we're at today to where things started. And if you have any comparisons of interest.
Yeah. So early on, Forrester didn't even cover security. It wasn't one of the hotter topics. And of course, Forrester covers it very well now. Um, my exposure at that point was really on the identity management side. So I covered, um, boy, do I sound like a dinosaur. I covered Novell, and I covered Microsoft, and Microsoft was then developing and producing Active Directory. And so the whole notion of an LDAP directory, of a central repository for identities, understanding what that meant, it was more at the time related to IT operations and kind of entitlements and things like that than security, but it was the roots of security. But in the 90s, there were kind of three areas. Well, besides identity, there were three areas that people covered in security. One was firewall, another one was IDS IPS, I guess IDS at the time, and the third was endpoint security. And at the time it was antivirus. And that was sort of the limits of what we looked at in security. Now I know that's a simplistic kind of description, but at least from an analyst perspective, those were the kinds of things we were covering. And I'm sure others look beyond that, but it was security was immature, and we were just learning about the threats.
Now, was there a firm called ISS at that time that rings a bell? That was bought by IBM. I feel like I've worked with.
Yes.
Okay, I have
Yeah.
worked with people that have talked about the early days of ISS and how there was a lot of you know um, interesting stories.
ISS was a pioneer. A friend of mine who I actually worked with was one of the founders, and Checkpoint was big into security. Cisco had the Pix firewall, and they bought a number of other vendors, and it made sense because we were really focused on network security at the time, and Cisco, of course, owned networking then. But yeah, ISS was a major player. Um, Took me a long time to break in and get some business out of ISS. But yes, they were bought by IBM probably in the early 2000s, I would say.
Okay, got it. Yeah, it's starting to come together because I've worked with others that have had long histories in cyber, and they often bring up the early days of ISS as you know, kind of the heyday or the Wild West of the industry when things were getting started. So it's interesting to hear. Um, okay, so from the Forrester experience, looks like your path went eventually to ESG, right? And I'd be curious to hear like how you transitioned into that starting point with ESG, because you remained there for the next 21, right? 21 years.
I did.
So yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting kind of story to hear how you got started at ESG.
Well, let me say this, Dan. It was an indirect path. I did not go from Forrester right to ESG. I worked at an internet startup, a venture backed startup I would say, in the telco area. And we raised a lot of money at the time. We raised the single biggest round in Massachusetts history. And we thought we were going to kill it, but we didn't. We there, if there wasn't Enron, this company might have been infamous, let's say, and I'll just leave it at that. But I lasted 9 rounds of layoffs there, and once I was laid off, the only jobs available were the VP of marketing at a VC-backed startup, and I just didn't have the appetite for that. So with the Forrester experience behind me, I kind of hung out my own shingle at the time, thinking about what I want to focus on. And this was a real transition and a real important point in my career is people I knew, and I've always kind of had beacons in my career, just people that I really respected, really smart people that I would look up to and felt like every time I talked to them, I got smarter. So I reached out to my beacons and I said, you know me, you know my skill set. What should I focus on? And they said, well, you've got this great skill set in network monitoring, network management, and you can apply that to security. And security is going to be much, much bigger over the next few years. So I did some of my own research and I liked it. I liked the fact that it wasn't just about speeds and feeds, but you had geopolitical concerns and law enforcement concerns and public safety concerns. And so I just started to do my own research. And at the time, ESG was looking to diversify. The founder of ESG is an old friend of mine. And so we started talking, and I said to him, well, what if I join, but I cover security? And eventually we came to terms on that, and he was willing to take a chance. And I started the practice in 2003, and it was a little rocky at first, but ultimately it worked out quite well.
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, ESG is now, it's a recognized brand in the industry for sure. And I've done projects with you guys, obviously, and we're, we've worked together on stuff in the past, and so ESG really, I guess, started, like you said, you started the practice, or you saw the inception of it up until I guess TechTarget eventually acquired ESG. Is that right? So
yeah, that's correct. It was like 3 years ago or so that TechTarget acquired ESG.
So along that journey of seeing, I mean, it must have been rapid growth at ESG, but along in parallel was the rapid growth of the cybersecurity industry as a whole as well, right? So it was, like you said, really perfect timing to really get started in that type of business trajectory. So any observations in terms of the growth? Like, how would you characterize that that path that both ESG and the industry were taking? And like even from a market dynamic standpoint, what are the key factors that really drive the industry, or were driving it and are driving it today? Are there any differences? I'd just be curious to hear your observations.
Sure. Well, ESG, I mean, it was a gradual growth. It was only me. I covered everything in cybersecurity, and we had to reestablish ourselves. We did have a big breakthrough when Symantec bought Veritas, because I had a background in the storage industry from EMC, and now I was covering security. And of course, Symantec was a security company. Veritas was a data management storage company. And Symantec struggled to articulate the value to the market and to Wall Street. So we reached out and we said, look, this is our perspective. This is what we think you should do. And John Thompson, who was the CEO at the time, said, well, you're so smart. You come out here and talk to my executive team. And he did. He flew me out, and I spoke to the executive team. And the AR person was really nervous, because he's like, I'm putting you in front of the CEO and the executive team. Are you sure you're up for this? And maybe there was some trepidation, but it all worked out. That was a big break. Now, I'd say we grew organically over time. We added people. We built our reputation. It took a lot of hard work, a lot of publishing, a lot of research, just to show the market that we knew what we were talking about. We were committed to it. And now there are I believe, 5 analysts in cybersecurity, and the business is quite healthy. In terms of the market, though, it's interesting. So when I started at ESG, the big concern were things like the I love you virus and SQL Slammer and the bagel. I mean, just all of those. And this may be, again, this may not even be known to people in cybersecurity now, but that was really the big concern, at least for most companies. Now, the U.S. federal government had some intrusions that it was very concerned about. But most companies were just concerned with like the stoppage of a worm hitting all of their PCs at once and the cost of restoring all those. I'd say a big transition was around 2005, 2006, when PCI came into play. And then there was a compliance issue. And at the same time, there was the California data privacy law, and then other state laws that followed, and other global laws that followed. And that really was a shot in the arm to the industry. And then it's grown from there and to where it is today. So it's much, much bigger than it was. It's much more front and center. So we used to always complain, oh, it's not a business issue. The business people don't take it seriously. There was an expression in the market that business people don't want good security. They want good enough security, so to check the boxes. There was this notion in the boardroom that we're not a target. And that's certainly less pervasive than it is today. But on the downside, I'd say there's much more money in the market today, and there's Wall Street involved, and certainly the VC community, and that's a good thing for innovation. But sometimes, and I really do believe this, that at least the technology vendors, the VCs, lose the fact that this is about public safety. This is about all of our data, and when you think about critical infrastructure, this is about lives being protected or lost. And so I think there's a much bigger mission that certainly cybersecurity professionals live up to, and that's their day-to-day. That's what drives them. I don't think the industry really gets that. And those players that do tend to prosper, and players that don't, I mean, it's too much of a money game, and that concerns me.
Totally agree. I mean, you look at the stories recently, children's hospitals held at ransomware, and, utilities and services, water supplies and electrical, it is such a massive national security focus that cyber is playing a role in. And I think, sometimes the lines get too separate in terms of private versus, public. And there needs to be more of like an integration, like, hey, these tools and services that the industry is providing are part of national security, right? So it is definitely a factor that I agree with you on that sentiment there. Yeah. So, and then, obviously, like you mentioned, there's so much investment. There's a lot of companies. I think Richard Steinen of IT Harvest published 3,700 or 3,800 vendors now. And his recent estimate was like 10,000 plus security products, right? So, do you see a trend toward more of that? Like, are we in 10 years going to have 20,000 products and 10,000 vendors? Or do you see a trend toward, consolidation?
That's a good question. So I absolutely see a trend toward consolidation, and you see it with the M&A activity from the big companies and the whole platformization. There was an article I think it was in yesterday's Investors Business Daily, that said the new buzzword in security isn't AI, it's platform, which makes me laugh because in 2016 at ESG, we coined the term SOPA, which stands for Security Operations and Analytics Platform Architecture. So we were thinking that these things had to come together years ago. Now, what I will say is the industry is moving, and this really is IT, not security, but is moving too fast for there ever to be any kind of Uber platform. So there'll be multiple platforms. And then in areas of rapid innovation, there'll still be startups and there'll still be focused products on different threats or different operational needs. And so I'd like to see a more federated model where we have maybe some open standards on how different systems can communicate. Because we talk about consolidation, and I've read all the data about average company has 70 different products and things. Yeah, but when you're talking about a really large enterprise, that's not going to change overnight. And the CISO's job is to constantly look at their portfolio and rationalize it. That's any manager's job. So I think there's a little bit of both, Dane. I hate to be wishy-washy, but I think platforms are absolutely going to happen. It makes sense in some areas, but in other areas, there'll be federation, there'll be specialization, and there'll be M&A.
Obviously, we have to touch on AI, right? It couldn't be a cyber discussion today without mentioning that, because of the potential for disruption and impact. I guess if you look at natural language processing, just the abilities that you have today, I'm blown away personally by the extra capability from even a product marketing perspective that tools like generative AI can provide me as a professional. And I'm not a SOC analyst, but I have to imagine that type of, enhancement of the ability to just say, hey, check out this IP and do all these things that I used to do manually. So I'm curious in your perspective there. Like, do you see, well, just to touch on the adverse aspect of that, or the inverse, is that attackers are also getting these tools as well, right? So do you think defenders are going to have the advantage, or adversaries with the, progression of AI?
So before I semi-retired in early February, we'd asked that question in different research, I think 4 times. 3 out of the 4 times it came out that the respondents were cybersecurity professionals. So 3 out of the 4 times, the data came out where it was pretty well skewed towards cyber adversaries have the advantage. And once it came out that cyber defenders had the advantage. Now that one was more of a broad-based audience. So I think in cybersecurity professionals' mind, they're concerned about the adversaries having the advantage. And I, for one, think that's healthy, because if I'm the CISO, I want my people thinking, what are the adversaries doing? I want them reviewing the threat intelligence. I want them imagining the vulnerabilities that they could exploit, because then we can mitigate risk. We can understand risk and measure it. Now, I do think that defenders will get some advantages out of AI. But those advantages are going to be generic, meaning I can take a junior analyst and give them now some help. So it's like a driver assist in a car. It's like that's what it'll be for a junior analyst. And so they'll see things like, well, here's more data to enrich an alert, and here's a process that might take place now that you've done your alert triage. Maybe it's linking it more closely to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, something like that. So I do believe that's good. And then I believe more experienced analysts will get advantages too. But here's my concern, is that I think AI will come in through the back door at such a rapid pace. And there's such a good business case for AI in certain applications like customer self-service and any kind of inventory management, things like that. And ultimately, we're going to have to put policies in place for that, governance in place. We'll have to have the tools for policy enforcement. We'll have to monitor behaviors. And I think that that's going to overwhelm security professionals, especially in companies that really aren't kind of at the top of their game. CISOs I talk to recognize this. The question is, have they got the board's attention? Do they have the budget to overcome it? Do they have the business people understanding what they can and can't do with AI? And then, of course, do they have the controls in place? And those are big questions that I can't answer right now. ESG is tracking that. I'm tracking it in my new semi-retired role.
Yeah, no, it's all interesting. And, you did touch a little bit on this kind of what keeps the CISO up at night. And that's always a good question, I feel like, just to get your perspective on if you had to list the top three things, is it like can't find enough people, the technologies aren't, delivering what we need, the budget aspect, like there's so many variables and it's such a difficult job to have. But what would you say those top three things are?
Well, I'd say the first one is the ability to accurately gauge cyber risk, because that's a bear. No one can do that. Well, I don't want to be hyperbolic. It's very difficult to do. We have lots of guidelines. So things like the CIS, critical controls, really, really good. Good guidelines. And those, the NIST controls, very good guidelines. The problem is, I see two problems. One is scale and one is decentralization. So the scale, meaning if I have let's say I have 5,000 employees, I probably have 50,000, 100,000 assets that are constantly changing. And the other thing is decentralization, is that those assets are controlled by different groups using different tools with different processes, maybe different paces of monitoring. And somehow I have to aggregate all that data and go to the board and say, here's where our risks are. Here's what I can do to mitigate those risks. Here's how much it's going to cost me. Are you willing to fund that? That's really, really difficult to do. The way we get around that is with what we call crown jewel security, which is really focus on business critical assets, which makes a lot of sense, except business critical assets are connected to non-business critical assets. Developers are taking code off of those business critical assets and doing more development. We connect to third parties with those business critical assets. So the exposure is just crazy. And there's nothing in the cards that says it's going to get easier. It's going to get much, much harder. And I'd say that's the chief concern of CISOs. Everything else, yeah, they're concerned about adversaries targeting their industry or their company. They're concerned about ransomware. They're concerned about data theft. Those are all concerns. If I'm a CISO, I built a program around that. I've got experience around that. But I only have so many people. I only have so much time. And the IT universe that I'm dealing with is ever expanding. And that's a real concern, not only for CISOs, but we as an industry, we as a community need to be concerned about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like you said, doesn't seem to be getting easier anytime soon. Right. So, yeah, I think there's also a lot of, questions around or assumptions that there's a talent shortage, but then I see other positions that this is actually far-fetched and not based on reality. There's enough, cyber talent to go around. What's your perspective there? Are there enough people in the industry to fill all these roles that CISOs are looking to hire for, or do you feel that we need to do a better job of, making sure that happens?
Yeah, so I can answer that definitively. And I'm sure some people would argue, but I've got the data to prove it. I've done this research project with the Information Systems Security Association, ISSA. We are now working on, and I'm still working on this, I'll present it to RSA, our 7th version. It's not quite annual, but we've done it 7 times. There is absolutely no question there's a skill shortage. Every time we ask that question, and I'll give you the 2023. I know the 2024 number. I can't say it yet, but in 2023, 71% of those we surveyed said their organization is impacted by the cybersecurity skill shortage. What's the nature of that impact? Well, overwhelming workloads, inability to hire experienced talent. Here's one for the industry, and this is PMMs, pay attention to this, is organizations buy security technology, but never have the time or resources to use them to their optimal potential. So think about how you can help your customers there. So absolutely, there's a skill shortage. Now, is it 3 million bodies like some people say? I really question those numbers. I don't know how people came up with those numbers. I've never seen the number of employed cybersecurity professionals around the world, let alone this gap in talent. But is there a gap in talent? Absolutely. Now, here's how it manifests itself at companies is they can find all the entry-level people they want, but they want mid-level, experienced people, and those people are really hard to come by. There's also a ton of attrition in the cybersecurity professional ranks, right? So I'm working for you, Dane. Someone else says, I'll give you 40% more. I'm gone. The other thing is, I work for you, Dane, but the culture, the cybersecurity culture really isn't there. The business isn't paying attention. I'm gone. So it's not just there aren't enough people, there aren't enough advanced skills, and there is churn in the market constantly. So, like I said, I have strong opinions on that area.
That's great to have that perspective, because it does kind of settle the debate a little bit, at least in my mind, considering, the research that you've been close to, and you're presenting. I just want to make sure we plug this and that everybody knows. So for RSA, this is going to be a presentation that you'll be presenting there on this topic. Is that right?
Correct. Tuesday morning, I believe it's at 8:30. It might be 8:50. They have weird times. I'm presenting with ISSA, which we've done year after year, but we're doing it again this year.
Great.
And hey, let me make one other point about this. So
Sure.
every CISO I ever talk to, I say to them, look at your security program and make sure that you consider the impact of the cybersecurity skill shortage in every decision you make. And so if you do that, then you look for opportunities to automate. You look for opportunities to outsource. You look for more intelligent solutions and AI-based solutions, because you want to make your staff more productive. And that's kind of the key, is because you're not going to hire your way out of this. So what can you do to make your staff more productive?
Right. Okay. So there could be a technology equation here to resolving this issue, right? So, okay. Yeah. Well,
Addressing. I don't know about resolving, but
not
addressing.
resolve. Yeah, okay. Yeah. No, that's so definitely be sure to, if you're at RSAC coming up in first week of May, be sure to check out Jon and Issa's session. It sounds like an interesting one. Hopefully I'll be there, because I'm going to be there. So I'm going to join that session if I can, for sure.
Yeah, please do.
All right. So let's maybe switch gears a little bit. When it comes to product marketing, right? Within cybersecurity, it's, like we talked about before, there's over 10,000 products, almost 4,000 vendors. So it can be a battlefield, right? For those of us that are representing vendors and talking about technologies. But, overall, I look at our role, really as bringing more clarity to that buyer's journey. And, like you said, FUD came up back in the day and hasn't really gone away as much as we would have hoped, but just trying to actually paint an accurate representation of what we deliver from a vendor perspective. But I was wondering, what other advice you might have for product marketers to be successful in terms of, the security buyer journey and making sure that we're aligned with, the actual realities that buyers are facing.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. So the first is everything in security is about efficacy, right? Pricing, your GUI, your integration capabilities, those are all important too, but everything is about efficacy. So that's important to articulate. The other thing is that there's a lot of noise out there, and I know I'm preaching to the choir. Is that the singing to the choir? But anyway, you have to figure out a way to sort through that noise. And the best way is to really understand what your customers are going through. And again, remember that security is about protecting their business. And so broaden your focus out from we block this kind of threat to, well, what does blocking that kind of threat mean to the business? And what else is around that threat? And so understanding the way your customers have to think, who is your customer, what pressures they're under is really important. But in terms of like getting out there, thought leadership is always something I really focused on, because the industry is going to be different in a year. And so where is it going to be? What are those threats? Where is the business changing that where you need that coverage? And then the one other thing, and I've been pretty aggressive with this in my years of coverage, is don't be shy about understanding the different needs of vertical markets. So, like, I've done some deep dives on healthcare, and there are completely different requirements in healthcare. So, for one thing, in a financial services company, about 30% of the data is considered business critical or regulated data. In healthcare, it's over 90%. So what does that change mean in terms of your defenses, in terms of your staffing, in terms of your network segmentation, in terms of your access controls, all of those things? It's sort of a luxury because you have to be a big company to start to do vertical marketing. But it's not a bad idea to kind of think through that as a product marketing manager, because there may be opportunities in a particular market that you could more easily exploit than just going broad-based.
That's great advice. Yeah. And touching on those higher level themes and how it relates from a business impact standpoint sounds like a really good perspective for PMMs to take away from that. And I guess one closing question for you, if you have another time for one more.
Absolutely, sure.
All right, great. So, just in terms of like, where if you're a younger PMM or even somebody who's been around for a while, what are like the good information sources that you would recommend in terms like any publications or Substacks, newsletters, people on LinkedIn to follow, stuff like that, where you would kind of plug into to keep in tune with industry news and developments?
There is so much now, Dane, that it's hard to isolate things. But I would offer this. So first, I would say join ISSA. And I'm not just pushing that because I work with ISSA or some local user group, because you really want to connect with users. You really want to hear their stories, what they're going through. So I think that's really valuable, and a lot of companies will pay for that membership. So I tend to watch a lot of YouTube videos. I learn very well. My learning style is to kind of start with videos and then read afterward to fill in the blanks. But there are YouTube videos on anything you want. So I did a big research project on threat intelligence analysis, not in 2023, but in 2022. And boy, did I learn a lot from watching different SANS presentations. AttackCon had some presentations, RSA, of course. But I mean, there's just so much to learn, and there's so much to view there. So it's really important to continue. I mean, as an analyst and even now, I mean, just always strive to learn more about what's going on. in terms of individual periodicals, it sort of depends on what you cover. I mean, so like looking at the threat reports, looking at things like Krebs on security, those are good if you're kind of threat focused, but may not be as good in other areas. So um, cherry pick. There's search security. I write for search security. I write for CSO Online.
Okay, and so if anybody's interested, they can just, I guess, Google that or search for your name plus Tech Target or your name plus CSO online, and they'll find your publication there, right?
Oh yeah, they'll find my stuff and lots of other good stuff.
Okay, so Jon, any closing comments for Cyber PMMs?
Yes, Dane. I'll go back to a couple of points I made before, and that is cybersecurity is incredibly difficult for your customers, and they may not have the right resources, either financial or human, and they may not be able to kind of adhere to best practices. So think about that. Um, a security product, software, hardware, SaaS, doesn't matter, that's not used to its optimum potential is not going to be good enough and may not be successful. And so, what can you do to make your customers successful? Customer success is huge. And so, making things easy for them, guiding them, communicating with them, really, really important. And then, if you do all that, you have reference customers, make it easier for the salespeople. So, um, again, just remember how difficult this is and how big a mission it is.
That's a great perspective to have. And Jon, as always, it's a pleasure, having your time, and I'm really eager to share this with our audience. And if anybody wants to tune into your work, I think we mentioned that earlier, but it sounds like 2 publications right now at Tech Target and CSO Online. So if you want to hear more from Jon Oltsik, you can plug in there. Attend the RSAC session if you are out in San Fran in May. And yeah, stay tuned for more at Cyber PMM on LinkedIn or cyberpmm.com. So, Jon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Dave.